Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Daniela Bleichmar. I am the director of the Levan Institute for the Humanities, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this book chat where we celebrate a new publication by our colleague Nayan Shah, Refusal to Eat, a Century of Prison Hunger Strikes. We do invite everyone, if it is possible for them, to turn on their camera. It is nicer to see faces when we can than to see stills or photos. We have 1 hour together, and the way this will work is we will first hear a brief introduction to the project by Nayan, and then he will be joining conversation by Antoinette Burton from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and Lisa Hajjar from the University of California at Santa Barbara, a conversation moderated by our colleague Ange-Marie Hancock Alfaro. After about 35 minutes of conversation, we will open the forum for questions. Please use the reaction function to raise your Zoom hand to let Ange-Marie know if you have a question. And we will end sharp at 1 p.m. So welcome. Thank you so much, Nayan, for your book, for being here today to celebrate and discuss us. And please, would you introduce us to the project?
Sure. Thank you so much for organizing this, Daniela and Isabella. It's really exciting to be in conversation with Antoinette Burton, Lisa Hajjar, Ange-Marie Hancock, and with all of you. So the book is really, it does many things, but Refusal to Eat is really grappling with what it means to go to the edge of human endurance for one's cause and one's conscience. And it looks at that aspect of withdrawal from eating, as a kind of last resort personal power that prisoners use to escape some measure of sovereignty over their body at a most fundamental level. It's a jiu-jitsu move in many ways. Rather than causing material harm to an adversary, a hunger strike is an alarming exposure of harm to the striker himself or herself. It, however, foists responsibility for the striker's self-destruction onto the state's authority and holds culpable the state's power, which in fact authorities, as much as they try to deflect that responsibility or mitigate it, begin to assume it. So by choosing a hunger strike, a prisoner takes the battle with authorities to a different plane, one that lays bare the stakes of living and dying and tips the advantage in some ways to the prisoner. And this project is one that looks at that larger process of exploring what it takes to resist and oppose state power within the precincts of the prison and to broadcast that opposition with this tool of hunger striking. And I really recognize the ways in which it's a historical process and one over a century plus of time that has been named a hunger strike, recognized as such. And I think this is really important because what I wanted to sort of do in this work is to really look at the lens of the rise of mass incarceration, the rise of carceral power, particularly administrative detention in the 20th and 21st century, how it's sort of connected to a crisis of democracy, an arena where people are fighting for demands politically for voice and vote and participation in governing society or in governing the outcomes of their lives. And it's also about what kinds of feeling and ideas and thoughts can actually move across a barricade of the prison. How does one motivate feeling and motivate action? And in this regard, I really had to learn a lot about the ways in which, if you looked across a whole set of different circumstances, from British suffragettes to anti-colonial rebellion in India and in Ireland and South Africa, prisoners in Guantánamo, the experiences of refugees in detention in Australia and the United States. What was it that allowed the striker's voice to actually move? How was the form of communicating what is a hunger strike, which is mutable and changeable in different hands? reach a larger audience, a larger public, and make something like a individual personal agony, a social agony, and a political question. I also, explore throughout the book the different ways in which the prisons are actually trying to create their own weapons and to fight hunger striking, and particularly how they use medical intervention to save the body, or in some ways to deflect attention from the different kinds of consequences of hunger striking, which really is about that fear that constantly haunts it around death and dying. So this project does a lot of different things. I'm really, I think that the dialogue will, really help in trying to give you the nuance and the dynamics that are going on. But I wanted to give you that kind of frame, just to give you a sense of what the larger stakes of the project are.
Thank you so much, Nayan, for those wonderful words. And I see that hopefully people can hear me, even though my video might be frozen. I am thrilled and honored to be able to be the moderator for this book. As a method of full disclosure, we discussed this at the Times Book Festival last April. So I may insert some of my questions and follow-ups just as we go along, just to move the conversation forward. But I'm delighted to turn things over right now to Professor Antoinette Burton, please.
Great, thank you. So I'm very happy to be here. I've been on the journey of this book a little bit, and it's very, very wonderful to be in everyone's company today. I just want to say, by way of prefacing, that at the level of both personal story and collective action, what this book shows us is the agony of embodied suffering and the considerable historical consequences of the hunger strike as a political tactic, even when it fails. One thing that Nayan's book does incredibly effectively is to show how much modern geopolitical history turns on hunger strikers, both seen and unseen, as well as the role that networks of solidarity in both real time and across the century have played in shaping the impact of this weapon of the week. So really wonderful writing that I highly recommend to everybody. My first question is a bit of a general one. One of the most inspiring features of a truly great book is that it says to the reader, you thought you knew what this subject was, but think again. There are many such think again moments in this book. Can you talk about a few of them?
Thanks, Antoinette. There are so many, right? So one of the things that was important for me to do is to try to highlight some of the hunger strikers we know about, Bobby Sands, or protest fasters like Gandhi, or perhaps people know about Alice Paul, and put them in juxtaposition with other people who are less well known. So trying to understand why it is that in 1909, when the British suffragists are being thought of as the first hunger strikers, there's a woman in Spokane, Washington, who's Agnes Fair, who's actually also protesting her imprisonment by refusing to eat, but she's called, her struggle is called out as a starvation strike, one that sort of changes the direction of how people perceive her. Someone maybe to be pitied, but not to be concerned about, because her condition as a poor working class woman, as an orator, is one in which the suffering is sort of anticipated upon her. There are other kinds of instances in which we might think that, again, sort of starting off with the suffragists, like to be thought of as having mental illness, to not be in control of one's own reason, might actually be would put you into a sort of further carceral tomb, would get people to enact different things on you without your ability to deal with them. But if we look at Australia and refugee detention that's occurring on Manus Island and in different places like Woomera, we begin to learn that the call to mental illness and mental instability and to the shattering of one's spirit is actually a way in which hunger strikers there were able to access care. And what they really wanted was to be able to be part of a kind of care regime in Australia to be thought of as people who weren't just sort of foisted off and forgotten. So those are some of the different kinds of elements that are maybe known and unknown. One that was really important to me was really reckoning with my own experience in 1989 in South Africa. I came to South Africa in 1989 as a student. I just graduated. I was doing some work with organizations that were anti-apartheid organizations, but they were, you know, involved in issues like housing and stuff like that. While I was there was hundreds of people were on hunger strike, and there were these protests that were emerging everywhere, and I was part of that. And I remember so vividly this one strikers who was released saying, you know, I've seen the worst that apartheid can do. It will fail and fall. And to an audience of people who were so concerned about being put into detention that they didn't even imagine. They respected this man's endurance, but they couldn't imagine what he was talking about. But a year later, you know, I'm in Chicago and watching Mandela being released, and recognizing that there's something that's longer sort of in motion about this sort of crumbling of apartheid that's occurring that didn't seem like it was very possible at the moment. And so that long duration of what the impact of a hunger strike can be was something that, you know, always concerned me, and I didn't really understand how to grapple with it. But I wanted to go back and sort of see what the different kinds of connections were, what was moving across.
Thank you, Nayan. Lisa, would you like to pose a question next?
Sure. Thank you. I also want to say thank you to Nayan for writing this really powerful book. And I was, you know, thought I might just reference briefly from your conclusion. The questions that I want to focus on today is how hunger striking, you know, the hunger strikes and their demands and the political context get conveyed, and how that may or may not have political impact. And I'm just going to actually read just a few lines from Nayan's conclusion, which helps focus my question. So he says, the most consistent and persuasive forms of hunger strike are laced into an individual heroic story that conveys the personal experience of agony. Striking bodies are identified and distinguished by voice, spirit, and name. The hunger striking story is effective when it offers realistic details from the prisoner's cell, conveying the true to life immediacy and urgency of prison conditions. And today, probably the most visible hunger striker is Abdel Fattah, who's a 40-year-old Egyptian, you know, political activist, human rights activist, and he has been on hunger. He was arrested. He served 5 years in prison in Egypt from 2014 to 2019, and then shortly after he was released, he was rearrested, and he's been convicted of a 5-year sentence for political activities. Essentially, the Sisi regime was mad that he posted on Facebook about Egyptian torture. That's essentially why he's in jail. And for the last 200 days, he was on a 100-calorie diet, you know, 100 calories intake a day to push. The main demand was to push Egypt to allow British consular access. And he just announced that as of today, he's only drinking water, which means 0 calories. And on Sunday, he announced to his family that he plans to stop even this. And so it's a total strike. A quote from something he wrote to his family was, "I've decided to escalate at the appropriate time my struggle for freedom and the freedom of all prisoners." And the significance of this timing is very much tied to the fact that he has British citizenship, which his mother arranged for him, because she was actually a British citizen while he was in prison. And the new Prime Minister Rishi Sunak of Britain is going to Egypt for the COP27 World Conference, and many other world leaders are there. And so this is very much tied to that. I'm just wondering, Nayan, if you could maybe comment on the significance of that kind of global visibility and the nature of demands, you've made many examples of that in your book.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I mean, I want to first sort of contextualize what you situated in what I wrote about how sort of the way in which the mode of communication is really important. And so the idea of it was sort of very important for me to sort of a project that I thought was about, for me, started off with like my reckoning with what was happening in South Africa in the 1980s, took me back to the early 20th century and seeing the ways in which an individual struggle is highlighted and the ways in which the narrative that's being both smuggled out in notes and in lawyers' communication and repurposed into news articles is really trying to show that individual struggle and that individual name is being articulated, and that realism is the way in which, talking about the conditions of the prison, talking about the various conditions of why this moment of escalation is happening, to provide that narrative, and to really summon it with this idea of reason and determination, that this is a rational act, that this is something that one's come to after much suffering, after trying many other opportunities to change the way in which the authorities are treating them, and particularly in situations where you don't feel like you're getting a fair trial, your rights are being denied. So all those things are constellated in ways, and I think that what's very important to understand is that even when it's succeeding, and I think this is a case, Abdul Fattah's case is actually where it's succeeding. It's getting this kind of press. It's getting this kind of wide purview because it's sort of following certain kinds of ways in which the form of hunger striking, the form of protest is actually being activated to sort of speak to a larger audience around injustice, around a denial of rights, around the different ways in which pressure can be put to particular kinds of political entities to make change, and solidarities can be mobilized. The really challenging thing, I think, for any hunger strike is that even though there's no one format or formula, and it's constantly mutable and adaptable in certain ways, there is something about how, as someone like Diana Taylor says, the witnessing and sharing of a striker's trauma is a really important element of what has to happen. And self-starvation itself may mean something as political speech for the person who's engaged in it, but it has to actually shape and is really dependent on the understanding of the people who are listening or receiving information. And so I think, Lisa, like this is a situation where, as you're suggesting, like part of what the timeliness of the way in which Fatah is making certain kinds of demands and escalating the withdrawal of food and drink is really aimed at trying to put pressure at both an international audience and a national one, as well as various different kinds of constituents around a larger problem around who has access to this thing we call human rights, and how is it actually being activated? So I think that that's my sort of sense of the way in which to think historically about the larger project. But Lisa, if you have another,
I have a follow-up on that one, because I would just, since Allah has now announced that he will fast to the death,
yeah.
Could we maybe just briefly talk about the impact of Bobby Sands's fasting to the death and what that kind of to the death means? Because not all hunger strikes are even intended to lead to death.
Right. Right. No, I think, thank you so much for bringing that up. And I think it's really important to bring up Terrence McSweeney, actually, before even Bobby Sands. 1920 in Brixton prison, this is a person who was involved in anti-British activity in Cork. He was taken to Brixton prison as a kind of symbol. And there he enacts this hunger strike to the death. And what ends up happening in the British, sort of media stage is that there's a slow watch to his death, and building solidarity after 30, 40, 50 days of his refusing to eat. But he also laces it with a spiritual kind of meaning, that his strike is both about Ireland, a free Ireland, but also about sort of his Catholicism, his religious fervor is put to the fore as to why he's doing something that would even go against his religion, taking his own life, but he's determined to do so. So this sort of process is then played out in Catholic communities in Barcelona and in New York and in Boston and Chicago and in Melbourne. There's all these different kinds of vigils that are happening. So Bobby Sands actually uses a similar set of devices. He uses a kind of both allows a spiritual argument around his own suffering to be created, and a political one around Northern Ireland. And I think it's really important to sort of think there have been many hunger strikers in Palestine and Egypt who have also married a kind of spiritual withdrawal, connected it to fasting traditions within their own country. People are doing sort of sympathy strikes, sort of refusals to eat, short-term duration, and that making that kind of epic, like I will do this to the death, as a kind of bargaining to force the government to relent. And in some cases, McSweeney, Bobby Sands, Jitin Das in India, the government doesn't relent, allows him to die. But in Palestine, Israel, many of the hunger strikes have gone almost to what would seem like an endpoint. And then there's this kind of moment that transforms. It's also really important to understand whether the Egyptian authorities will use forcible feeding at this stage. And to use it at this end stage is actually more likely to produce catastrophe as well. It's more likely to result in his demise. So I think you're right that there's this kind of, we're all gathered at this sort of like, the idea is to gather at this precipice and be looking onto this kind of struggle of life and death, and what it means in a larger fold, and why it could connect to people politically, culturally, spiritually. And in some way, even though most hunger strikes, as you rightly point out, are about people surviving to the edge of human endurance, whatever that may be for them. There are these instances of people dying on hunger strike that also produces this concern of whether martyrdom is being produced or a legend is produced. So Bobby Sands has become like a metonym of a legend of the hunger strike that goes to the very end, and one where the British, say we're not going to do anything, mostly because 6-7 years before, they decided they were no longer going to force feed, because that was leading to all kinds of concern about the kind of torture that was being experienced by the hunger striker being forced to be fed against their will. So these are just these amazing dynamics, which are also producing a durational struggle, a theatrical one, that has sort of widespread political and ethical manifestations.
Thank you for that. I do want to pivot to Antoinette, but also think about the ramifications as communicative technologies change across the 20th century, and certainly, being able to announce on Twitter or on social media that this is where you're going to go versus the family of Terrence McSweeney. That's what made me think of it, right? Being the only real report on Terrence McSweeney's behalf of what's going on with him, and how that varies, because of course the trauma can go viral now in a way that it could not in the same way. And I think there are ramifications that others have talked about, right? About sharing those kinds of traumas and looking at that online repeatedly versus reading about it in a newspaper.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really helpful, because it is the technologies of the media are shifting and changing in really powerful ways. It's the medium of print that's being sent around telegraphically, so that people are seeing it in different places, different kinds of small mentions in newspapers, is really what affects the kind of hunger striking of the 1909 to 1920s period. Photographic representations of people on demonstrating. Also, you know, whether it's sympathy strikes or protesting or funeral vigils, are some of the different mechanisms that are being used. It's important to understand that the medium of photography and graphic imagery, like posters and images graphically of the hunger striker, keep on shifting and changing over time. It's really in the digital era, we see with particularly with the struggles in Guantanamo, this way in which the immediacy of both the ways in which first hunger striking is placed into a textual way, into newspapers in different ways. Since there are no visual imageries involved, people's protests are put in, and then reenactments of forcible feeding are being used in different ways to sort of create sort of more of the confrontation and the agony in places like Guantanamo. And I think that you know, refugee detention has used a lot of social media very early on, you know, in Australia and the United States, to galvanize supporters, to show different kinds of imagery. But very often the image of the protester, the hunger striker themselves, is not available, or an image of them earlier is available. So you see them more hale and hearty, and then you sort of see the sort of, and the idea of them being under duress is then visualized in different ways, sometimes enacted, to sort of by people who are supporters, family members, as well as by celebrities in varieties of ways. Most deaths sort of being shown in forcible feeding. You know, even Catherine Dunham with Haitian hunger strikers going on a sympathy strike, being photographed with various political figures visiting her to draw attention to the Haitians that are on hunger strike in 1992. So there's these different ways in which there's constant experimentation going on. And immediacy is interesting because there's a way in which there is that kind of immediate image that might be coming on your feed, but there's other forms of what will get people to talk and communicate. And I think this is also a really interesting aspect of the earlier period of what would get people to motivate them to actually demonstrate, to be part of a demonstration, and how demonstrations themselves create their own energy around the solidarity, sort of following the suffering of the hunger striker, making it part of one's own story. Those elements are really actually also important about how people experience immediacy, how they talk about or communicate about what hunger striking is and why it matters for them to be engaged in this protest.
Thank you for that. I'm keeping my camera off, but Antoinette.
So I think the book addresses this implicitly, and you've been referencing it in your answers, but I wanna make a more pointed question to you. So recently, in a controversial essay for the American Historical Association's monthly newsletter, Perspectives, AHA President James Sweet said some stunning things about the relationship of the past to the present in historical writing, namely that historians today think too much through our contemporary moment, and that we need to interrupt that trend and get back to seeing the past on its own terms. That is not a quote, that is my paraphrase. I think I can think of so many ways in which your book is a powerful refusal of that claim, but I'm keen to hear how you see it bearing on this question, which seems to be incredibly, in 2022, riling the historical profession.
Yeah. No, thank you, Antoinette. I was really stunned also by James Sweet doing that, and what his intention was is something obviously that's up for a lot of debate. But I think that for me in this project, there's such a powerful dialogue between what's happening in one's moving, roving present and trying to understand deeply what the context of struggles were in a prior moment in which I didn't quite know what all the story was. And I think that what's really been fascinating for me is trying to move both in time and also across different kinds of circumstances to see what different kinds of connections are when often hunger strikes are talked about within national struggles or a particular kind of political struggle, and they end up telling a national story. They end up reproducing it in many ways. And that might be really at stake in the context of the political struggles that are going on. But there's a larger process that's been happening around the use of mass incarceration to clamp down on dissent, criminalization. There's a larger story about different ways and strategies of creating solidarities across different kinds of moments, and also thinking in terms of time and history. So I remember so vividly the first time I encountered this poster that was done by a Palestinian solidarity group that looked at hunger strikes across different timeframes to try to draw resonance to the particular hunger strike of a Palestinian that they were trying to promote, but connecting it to Bobby Sands and Gandhi and Mandela, connecting it to other struggles around what it means to think about the duration by which one could refuse to eat, and what the consequences of that could be to one's physical body. So I think it's really important to think about how the change that's wrought is a constant dialogue. It was personally a dialogue with past and present for me. My past, my contemporary moment, looking at experiencing refugee detention, hunger strikes, and Guantanamo, and this dialogue with trying to understand what was going on in the struggles around speech and petitioning and voting and rebellion that were happening in Ireland and India, in England, in the United States, with what's happening in South Africa, what was happening in Holy Lake Stockade when Japanese weren't being incarcerated in a prison within a prison, and when there was no media attention about what was happening within. Still, there were struggles that were happening that we can understand. And for me, it seems really important to ask that question, what viscerally happening to one person moves another, and how it is that we might have a particular epoch of time in which we see some of these struggles reverberating through media across different geographic thresholds. And yet we still have to ask ourselves the question, why are some hunger strikes, something that motivates people's actions and others fall away? And what motivation is enough to make change? And how do we even understand that long, gradual process of change? Sometimes that can sort of hit and light at a particular moment, and then for a long time feel like nothing is happening. Nothing moves. But when you realize that for many of the survivors of hunger strikes, they're in it not because of the hunger strike, they're in it because they have a cause that they're struggling with, and they want to see political change happen for themselves or for others. And they're going to endure many things to get there, hunger striking being one of them. So I hope that addresses some of the implicit question that you had, Antoinette.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So we have one question from Lisa, and then as I put in the chat, we'll pivot to group questions. So please just use the Zoom function to raise your hand after Lisa and Nayan have their last exchange.
Okay. So Nayan, just following up on what you were just talking about, like when hunger strikes occur in the context of and for the purpose of national strugglers, it's sort of easier to frame both the cause and the people and their suffering, the strikers and their suffering. That's something that's really been lacking about Guantanamo, because the only thing detainees had in common was that they were Muslim males captured in, the war on terror. And so the hunger strikes at Guantanamo, and aside from that, it's also just the difficulty, the complete control the government has over information about what's happening at Guantanamo. So it's just really like a big, kudos to Carol Rosenberg, who, everything we know about Guantanamo, we probably know largely because Carol Rosenberg has been the indefatigable journalist. But I just wondered, in terms of if we bring it to the question of the force feeding and the ethical issues, force feeding is literally like this utterly clear paradox. Is the government going to allow someone to act in that agency and kill themselves? Or because the person isn't, this is the argument the US government gives, or one of the many US government arguments about force feeding at Guantanamo was because it would, the US is completely responsible for these people who are in their custody, and so therefore that reason. So it's this weird, thing. I was wondering if you might comment briefly on the, some of the great insights you have in your book about the ethics and politics of force feeding.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I want to say that, everyone should go out and read Lisa Hajjar's book, The War in the Court, because it's really about how lawyers and journalists are amplifying these different kinds of struggles, but also about the impasse of what's happening in these courts around administrative detention in Guantanamo, around and the sort of failure of the different kinds of successive regimes. But one around forcible feeding, one of the things that's really one, it has such a long history. It's sort of, it's part of the process of taking carceral instruments that were used in the mental asylums and used on slave ships and used in prisons and pulling them together into a weapon against hunger striking, a weapon to combat it. And that the British were using in England and in Ireland, and what is really important to appreciate is that the ethical political questions around forcible feeding and medical ones are manifesting themselves in the very moment when it's first instituted. They're being played out in the press and in medical journals and in the courts in England when they first decide to implement it against hunger strikers and against suffragists. And what we have what we end up having is that the idea becomes that this is a technical problem to overcome the discomfort, the pain, the difficulty, and these objects can be assembled, artificial feeding can be improved. Look at the ways in which artificial feeding is improving over time in the hospitals and stuff like that. But that's really about care, where the central issue is what the patient is experiencing. That's not the prison. And so when you have Guantanamo, you have this kind of resurrection of forcible feeding that's emerging using all sorts of biomedical understandings and technologies, but with the same kind of coercive force and with the same kind of understanding that even with the incredible suppression of information that comes out of Guantanamo, there were still in the hunger strikes and the forcible feeding moments in which we would have this kind of relay of the intensity of those struggles. And even those struggles where hunger strikers in Guantanamo were actually using the mechanism of force feeding to prolong their hunger strike, knowing that they were not going to be allowed to die. They would, spit up. They would actually try to, have and demand different kinds of breaks to use the toilet, or they would, use different ways of even sucking in and throwing out the feeding liquid in order to continue their protest. So we have this ethical issue in which the World Medical Association, the American Medical Association, all have said that this is beyond ethical standards. In fact, so that physicians and nurses themselves may set up and oversight it, but it's orderlies, it's corpsmen that often do the work of forcible feeding. And those few instances in which you've actually had a nurse or a mental health orderly, talk about what the experience is, they sort of talk about how horrible it is, how they've never seen something so horrific as to force someone to eat, and that any kind of connection to the idea of artificial feeding in a hospital is just incongruous with what the actual course of experience is. It's, I think there's much more, of course, to say about this, but I think what we see is this longer duration of the struggle in which the similar kinds of strategies have been used and employed. And different points, governments have turned away from forcible feeding. But even when intentions have been there to, like in South Africa in 1990 and 91, physicians there were trying to create a protocol for how you would treat a prisoner, in hospital who needed to be replenished and refed, but on their own terms. All that information that was developed, all the scientific study that was developed, was then redeployed by prison authorities to actually make forcible feeding more efficient, but no less coercive, and no less, but to sort of muffle the voice of the person who is experiencing this incredible, the shattering of their will and their sovereignty of their body.
Thank you to both Antoinette and Lisa, and of course, Nayan, for that delicious exchange that we've all just had over the lunch hour. I'd like to pivot. We have Pamela, who has a hand raised. Would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Nayan. Thank you so much for this introduction to the book I haven't had a chance to read, but look forward to. One of the things I've always loved about your work, your last book, for example, is the way, you juxtapose events and, and forms of, behavior and actions that are not usually placed side by side, and all of the kind of insights we get from that. So it's kind of another version of saying, here you've taken events that are usually embedded in national, stories, right? And saying what can we learn by looking at them across time and geography. So I guess the question I have about that is were there any, I guess, just commonalities? Are there any kind of common features to the political entities, in which a hunger strike like this, either, can gain purchase or doesn't gain purchase? Is there anything specific about the political entities, or is it really irrelevant, going across all different types of political entities?
Yeah, thank you, Pamela. That's a great question. I think I would think about it in two different ways. One, it does seem like the ability to animate a political dialogue has a lot to do with what kind of organizations or oppositional political movements are sort of already in place about how to move a communication. So it's really important to sort of see what kinds of solidarity organizations can develop and how they develop their solidarities, so that they might have different purposes on the grassroots, or they might have different purposes politically, and different kinds of agendas and different kinds of constituencies. But what allows them to sort of build together to amplify a particular kind of strike and the cause behind it. So I think that sort of making those two things clear, seems to be very important about the ways in which the use of one's organization's own media apparatus and the ways in which they're seeding communication to other kinds of newspapers or television or the like is really important. That was really important for understanding why after, you know, 20 or 30 different kinds of hunger strikes, why a particular moment in 1989 in South Africa sort of blossomed, how different kinds of religious organizations worked with labor groups, with you know, grassroots organizations that were really dealing with literacy and other kind of basic needs to come together around a solidarity campaign. But on the side of the politics around government, it's also really important to understand that there are elements where it appears that there are forces that seem to be arrayed around continual suppression of a particular agenda that can shift and move in ways that are not perceivable necessarily until the sort of crisis of the hunger strike and its aftermath happens. And I think this is true in actually in trying to understand what's happening in England and the UK and in the sort of period, you know, before World War I and afterwards, both with Ireland and with women's rights and voting. I think it's true to understand, you know, what sort of high-level activity is going on in political power games in South Africa or in India. It's even partially a way of trying to understand the kind of stuff that's going on with changes in refugee detention in Australia, about what kinds of political struggles. So I think, yeah, it seems like there's just happening on two different levels, and it's really important to sort of keep in mind that sort of shifting is about where different moments of opportunity and crisis turn into forms of advantage that may have longer possibilities.
Thanks for that question. In the interest of time, I might ask Rachel and Anna to ask their questions, Nayan, is that okay? And
Sure.
then you'll be able to respond to both, and then I'll
Yeah.
pivot to Daniela.
Hi, Nayan. Thanks for this great talk. As you know, this book is really formative to my thinking. And I've been thinking a lot about this book, kind of watching the prison strikes taking place in Alabama that have been going on, and the kind of misunderstandings or misframings of the mainstream media, kind of constricting them as being about prison conditions when organizers have been very explicit that they're about struggling over a future, right? Pathways to release in a state where more than a quarter of prisoners are sentenced to life. And I'm kind of thinking about that illegibility in a kind of carceral prison reform kind of state and media kind of complex versus the kind of clarity of hunger striking that you talk about in many ways. And I'm wondering if there's kind of value in putting these strikes in conversation, or kind of understanding hunger strikes on a kind of spectrum of prison striking that are really about a kind of struggle over the future, or futurity, over a future that the carceral state has tried to determine or foreclose, right? And if, you know, in many ways, as you talk about the kind of body and life and medical instrumentation, there's a kind of exceptionalism of hunger strikes, but if there's a use in kind of putting them in conversation with other ongoing prison striking based on the future.
Hi, Nayan. I have to apologize for not having my cam on. I was making lunch, which was a very poor choice for me for the talk. But anyway, my question has to do with history writing and speculation, and the ways in which that shows up in your project. You kind of gestured towards it earlier when discussing the kind of visual culture, visual economy of representing hunger strikes. And I'm wondering if there are particular points throughout your book where speculation takes on a very important role in some of the cases that you're looking at.
Thanks, Anna and Rachel, for those questions. It's also really wonderful to be hearing from students of mine and to be in dialogue with you as I was writing those books, writing this book when we were having classes and seminars and discussing a lot of these issues. So let me first address Rachel's question around how to think about carceral prison reform and futurity. And I think that often with prisoner strikes that have been happening for people who, whether it's in California, now it's almost a decade ago, actually, where the issue was raised and articulated around solitary confinement and its use and abuse. And what's happening in Alabama today around, sentencing, and then sort of like about what the futurity of prisoners are. I think both of them really were about futurity. And I think many of the different kinds of questions around prisoners are. One of the things that's a little challenging around this research and work is how much and how frequently the people who are hunger striking for what they think of, what they say is an avowed political cause, why they're in jail and why they're striking, always trying to distinguish themselves from other prisoners. And so you have this constant move that's happening to sort of say that there are, real prisoners, and then we're political prisoners. And then that's played out in terms of categories of what the state also enjoys. But I think that the question around, which I posed in the conclusion of my book, was really about, can hunger striking ever end? Is there a possibility, can there be abolition of it? And it really went to the core of like what the regime of carceral power is that makes it impossible to end it, because it is a strategy in which, when other options of other kinds of striking, other kinds of petitioning, other kinds of ways of trying to think that you can still use the judicial system to have your case heard, when those are foreclosed, hunger striking becomes a strategy that seems like it's, both last ditch and the only strategy. And I think that that's the tension that's being played out. Futurity is so important to every one of these situations. And so I think the connections can be made about how people are imagining not only a future for themselves individually and in their particular situation, but a futurity for the world beyond them, and how they're kind of connecting what their struggle is to a future for all or a future for many. And I think that that's the way I would sort of imagine thinking about that. And that takes us really to the idea that Anna's bringing up around speculation. And so I think the act of visceral communication is an act of speculation. We cannot know someone else's body or their feeling or their hunger or their pain or their suffering, but we can imagine it. And this idea of how it is that that platform is being used to imagine and sense someone's hunger from whatever one's experiences, or sense one's distress, and sense the enormity of taking the step of a hunger strike, whether it's for a short duration, whether it's for a long one, whether it's started and stopped over time, is really so much at the fore of why it's, whether it's, journalists or historians or family members or artists that are trying to imagine what it means to engage in a form of visceral communication. They're experimenting with it. They're trying to figure out what details will really summon a response. And they're trying to speculate what the possibilities are as they're being foreclosed, or they could be opened up in terms of changing the world that is. I mean, they're all hungering for another world in a way, and sort of asking people to come into that imagination of what that other world could be, knowing full well that the present world is intolerable, insufferable, and impossible to endure. And so I think that that's the sort of message that goes back and forth that I think is really so powerfully put together by your questions. So thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here. I've seen so many people who I know and love and learned from and engage with. And it's so wonderful to feel like this is something that was very challenging to write and endure writing. And I'm really glad to be explaining why I did it and why the journey matters.
Well, on behalf of Levan, we also want to thank you, Nayan, for this wonderful book. For posterity, I will show it again onto the camera for the recording. Please do join me in applauding Nayan, Antoinette Burton, and Lisa Hajjar for an amazing conversation. And I'm going to turn it over to Daniela in a second. But again, Nayan, this is just a labor of love, it's clear. And I'm so honored to have been the moderator for this panel and to be part of the conversation for this really important work. Daniela?
Thank you, Ange-Marie. I was going to thank everyone, but you already did. So, but I will reiterate my thanks, and thanks to you for moderating. Thanks above all to Nayan. We always thank the author, but in this case, the material that you dealt with and the sensibility and thoughtfulness that you brought to such difficult topics, the way you opened them up was one for which I was profoundly grateful to you as an author. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I wanted to mention that we do these book chats every month to celebrate new books by colleagues at USC, and our next one will be on November 30th. It is a book chat organized by our friends at the USC Center for Law, History, and Culture, and co-sponsored by the Levan and the Kazan Institute, when we will be hearing from Jessica Margling about her new book, The Shamama Case, Contesting Citizenship Across the Modern Mediterranean. Thank you again to all the speakers and to Nayan.